The 1960s were a memorable decade for Marvel Comics as they introduced a lot of their famous characters in comic books. With their introductions came a number of amazing classic covers done by these great artists who are at the top of their game. Just who are these artists? In this video, I'm going to take a look at a number of these great artists who drew these amazing covers. What I've done is I've grouped these into two teams of 4 artists, 4 honorable mentions, and 4 who are the Mount Rushmore of these great cover artists. Okay, let's take a look at these honorable mentions first. Neal Adams, far better known for the covers he did at DC Comics, did do a handful of covers for Marvel in the 1960s, and exclusively on only one title, and that's the X-Men. These covers barely squeezed into the 1960s and have all been published in the year 1969. He also did the interior artwork for this series as well, which was at the time in trouble due to poor sales. As the story goes, when he went to Marvel, he was asked which title he would like to work on, and he said whichever one had poor sales. Despite the efforts of Roy Thomas and Neal Adams, they could not save the X-Men, and the title would go into reprint mode only a few issues after their last. Those handful of covers he did are quite something, and are sought after by comic book collectors. Colan is without a doubt one of the most underrated comic book artists ever. In the 1960s, he worked for DC, and Stan Lee essentially had to bribe him to come to work for Marvel. And he would go on to do some incredible work for Marvel in the 1960s and beyond. His most notable title was Daredevil, but you may be surprised to learn he co-created a number of prominent Marvel characters in the 1960s, including the original Captain Marvel and the original Guardians of the Galaxy. As well, he co-created the Falcon. Colan did some great covers for Marvel, and not just Daredevil. He also did a few of the 1968 launch titles as well, including Captain Marvel #1 and the classic cover of Iron Man #1. Steve Ditko, famously known as the co-creator and artist of Spider-Man, is not particularly known for his covers. He did all the artwork for Amazing Spider-Man numbers 1 to 38 along with 2 annuals, and while some of them are a bit too busy for my liking, they are iconic. The ones that stand out in particular for me are number 6, 24, number 28, and the classic number 33. You may not know this, but he also did a cover for Amazing Fantasy number 15, the very first appearance of Spider-Man, which is substantially different from Jack Kirby's cover. Jack Kirby's cover is definitely more dramatic and the better cover, although Stan Lee didn't want Spider-Man to look so muscular. What Steve Ditko is less known for are his pre-hero Marvel covers in the early 1960s. I think these are great, particularly Amazing Adult Fantasy number 13, which has a certain mood or uneasiness that Ditko is able to create that is unique with his work. I think what's tragic, though, is that he didn't do more Doctor Strange covers. The only full Doctor Strange cover he would do is Strange Tales number 146, which would also be his last issue doing Doctor Strange. If there is one unsung heroine of 1960s Marvel cover artists, it's Marie Severin. Marie Severin has a long history in comic books, particularly as a colorist doing a significant amount of color work for EC Comics in the 1950s. You may have also heard about her brother, John Severin, who was also an artist, who was working at EC Comics at that time. As EC Comics needed a colorist, she was able to step in, learn the processes, and do the job very well. She was multi-talented, and in the 1960s started working for Marvel, where she would also do pencils and some really great covers. In particular, a few covers for The Incredible Hulk when it was launched in its own title. The Incredible Hulk numbers 102, 104, and 105 are, in my opinion, classic Hulk covers. Before those Hulk covers, she also did some work in Tales to Astonish, in particular a nice cover with the Hulk and the Silver Surfer. She also did humor covers very well and did some great covers for Not Brand Ek, the self-parody humor series by Marvel in the 1960s, with number 10 being an outstanding covering featuring many of Marvel's characters at that time. So, who are the Fabulous Four, the Mount Rushmore of cover artists for Marvel in the 1960s? Well, let's jump right in. At number 4 is John Romita. You can justify his inclusion in the Fab Four on the strength of Amazing Spider-Man number 50 alone, but there would be several other great Spider-Man covers he would do in his classic run. One Spider-Man cover that doesn't seem to get as much attention is Spectacular Spider-Man number 2, a wonderful painted cover, and this may be due to the oversized format. You don't see too many painted covers from Marvel in the 1960s, so this is a great example. And it's a classic cover featuring Spider-Man fighting his arch-enemy, the Green Goblin. Here are a few other classic Spider-Man covers Romita did in the 1960s. In particular, the Mysterio ones are great. Before coming to Marvel, John Romita did a lot of work in romance comic books at DC, and he would get another chance to do some romance titles at Marvel towards the end of the 1960s. These are very underrated works by John Romita in my opinion, and as a collector, very hard to locate in nice shape. At number 3 is Jim Steranko. Many of Jim Steranko's covers for Marvel in the 1960s are instantly recognizable. What is incredible about Jim Steranko at that time was how quickly his work evolved and improved from his earlier work in Strange Tales to his later 1960s covers with the X-Men and Captain America. He would take a break from Marvel in 1969 and would later come back to do a few more covers in the 1970s. Steranko brought a fresh new direction in design, including the new iconic logo for X-Men with issue number 50. Even with less than 20 covers he did for Marvel in the 1960s, they are outstanding and deemed by many as classic covers. I'm a big fan of his work, and I even did a spotlight video on him a little while ago that you can check out at the link above. Number 2 on the list is John Buscema. With John Buscema, no other Marvel comic book artist had a greater peak when it came to penciling covers. In 1968, John Buscema did a staggering 25 covers for Marvel Comics, many of them classic covers. This is on top of doing all the interior artwork for these comic books as well. It's an unbelievable body of work. John Buscema originally started working in comic books in the late 1940s, but when the downturn hit in the comic book industry in the 1950s, he turned to doing commercial work, which he did for 8 years. He would return to the comic book industry in 1966, and boy, he came back with a vengeance. John Buscema's work output is legendary. There are some years he would do the equivalent of 3 to 4 issues a month. Incredible if you think that some artists struggle to do a single issue in a month. Let's take a look at some of these amazing covers he did, just in 1968. That would cement him as one of the greatest comic book cover artists for the 1960s. What John Buscema was able to do was create a lot of great action and energy with numerous characters on a cover. The Avengers were a perfect vehicle for this, but beyond that, he was also able to create epic impact covers with just 2 characters ready to engage. No doubt, Silver Surfer number 4 is considered one of the greatest comic book covers of all time. One of my personal favorites is Submariner number 8, which features a great Subby versus Thing cover, and is also a very entertaining issue as well. Who else could be number 1 but Jack Kirby? In the 1960s, his work is simply unmatched. I mentioned before that in my opinion, John Buscema had a higher peak, but Jack Kirby is the marathon winner hands down. He consistently created superb covers every year in the 1960s, starting from 1960 with his epic creations in Marvel's pre-hero monster titles. There's something magical about some of these covers. The originality, the forms, the expressions. It's hard to explain, but I think they're great. Jack Kirby would then go on to draw some of the most iconic superhero covers, starting with the Fantastic Four, Thor, and of course, the cover of Amazing Fantasy number 15. Now, not all of his covers are home runs. I personally don't think Tales of Suspense number 39 is particularly a great cover, or even The Incredible Hulk number 1. X-Men number 1 is somewhere in between for me, But it's just incredible to think that he was a part of all of this. His two most iconic runs would be Thor and, of course, the Fantastic Four. It seems anything with Galactus in it is just a home run when it comes to these covers. In particular, I always thought that any of what I would call silent covers, covers that had no text, were balloons, and only the trade dress, were some of the best. And this goes in general with other comic book covers for me as well. There are comic book fans that feel that Jack Kirby is overrated, and I used to be one of them. His proportions and perspectives can be askew, his anatomy is incorrect, but what I've learned to respect is the amount of energy and emotion he brings to his artwork. On top of that, the range of his work is incredible. He can do anything. Monster books, westerns, superhero, horror, everything. He also didn't peak in the 1960s, and you can go back decades before to the 1940s and see the quality of his work. There's a reason why he's called King Kirby, because he was simply the best at what he did. There you go, the greatest Marvel comic cover artists of the 1960s. If you're a comic book fan or collector, I think it would do you great to pick up a few examples of these awesome covers and just own a small piece of comic book history. If you enjoyed this video, you can check out another one of my videos over here. Until next time, enjoy and read your comic books.